Our next speaker is Amy Johnson. She runs the Virginia Working Landscapes program. They've got a great newsletter. They've got great content on their website. Check them out. Sign up for the newsletter. They send something out every so often, and I love watching beautiful pictures. They do great presentations. Dr. Amy Johnson, take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So I was happy that James brought up this type of landscape. This is the same kind of landscape we work with in Virginia. It's really a mosaic of land management, right? We've got pastures, we've got hayfields, we have orchards, vineyards, and it's all intersected by Shenandoah National Park, so also a lot of large, dense forests. It's also home to a lot of declining birds. Of course, we've spent a lot of time today talking about bobwhite quail. The way that we manage our land, the way we connect our properties is going to affect this declining population. The density at which we graze our cattle is going to affect the reproductive success of American kestrels. The way that we hay our fields, as Bernadette was talking about this morning, is going to affect our ground nesting birds. And even the way we manage our fields in the winter is going to affect overwintering grassland birds like the savanna sparrow in the bottom right. So why is this important? I think a couple of people have touched on this today, that we've lost nearly 3 billion birds, and of those, the grassland birds have been hit the hardest. More than 53% of grassland bird populations have just been lost. So this includes just incredible species like the bobolink. For every 5 that we had in the 1960s, we now only have 2 remaining. Our loggerhead shrikes, I don't know if you're familiar with these, but these are the coolest little bird. They act like raptors, but they're songbirds, so they have to impale their prey on thorns and barbed wire fences. We've lost 75% of this population, and in Virginia, we think we have less than 100 remaining. Our bobwhite quail, we've been talking a lot about these guys today, but their populations have declined by more than 80%. We only find them on about 10% of the sites that we study in Virginia. And the iconic meadowlark, 75% decline of this species over the course of just 50 years. So it's pretty alarming how quickly these declines are occurring. Several folks have mentioned what's causing these declines, so because we're kind of running late on time, I'm not going to get into these. But of course, it's just a variety of reasons. You know, they're all stacking on top of one another, making it really difficult for these birds. So in order to conserve these birds, we have to take a look at where they are. And as far as grassland birds are concerned, more than 82% of their distribution falls on private lands. And this is breeding grassland birds. But it's not specific to the breeding season. We also see a huge number of birds using private lands for their wintering habitat. So it's critical that we establish models that work for both the birds as well as the people. And this is why we started Virginia Working Landscapes based out of Virginia. So we are a Smithsonian-based program. We bring together scientists, community scientists, landowners, conservation NGOs, farmers, to study how our land management practices are influencing biodiversity. So we work in this region in Northern Virginia in 16 counties. To date, we've worked with over 250 private landowners covering nearly 90,000 acres and looking at biodiversity on these farms. We're focusing mostly on grasslands. So in Virginia, grasslands come in a variety of shapes, sizes, and land uses. So we've got, of course, livestock pastures, we've got active hay fields, we've got fallow post-agricultural fields. I love that use of the foreland. I've never heard that word before. I'm totally going to start using that. Wildlife preserves, so both hunting and nature preserves that folks are establishing using native grasses and wildflowers specifically for hunting or wildlife viewing. And these are the target species that we're focusing as far as our bird analyses. So while we're seeing over 100 different birds in and around these fields we've been studying over the last 10 years, this group in particular is relying specifically on our grassland and shrubland birds. So this includes some of those grassland obligates like the eastern meadowlark that nest directly on the ground, but also includes some of these early successional species like we've seen in earlier presentations like the yellow-breasted chat, the prairie warbler. All of these are declining significantly. So I just wanted to walk you through some of the analysis that we've run to just give you an idea of how well some of these habitat restorations are working in the state of Virginia. So over the last 10 years, we've sort of grouped categories of these fields into 3 different categories. We have our fallow fields, so they're kind of in a post-agricultural state. They're not actively being managed. Maybe they're being bush hogged or burned every couple of years or in patches on an annual basis. We also have what we call wildlife fields, and we worked really closely with the Virginia Quail Recovery Initiative, which I don't think they're called that anymore, but our private lands biologists, so Mark Puckett, David Bryan, Justin Folks helped us get together with some landowners who are implementing some grassland restorations. So those are the wildlife fields we called here. And then we're also working with traditional agricultural fields, so fields that are hayed or grazed. And we're just looking at general bird abundance and diversity. How are our bird species using these 3 field types? And what we found through these collections is that our shrubland birds, so for example, indigo buntings, common yellowthroats, we're finding in much higher densities in these wildlife fields. So the fields that we've actively established into native warm season grasses and forbs are hosting higher densities of some of these shrubland species. Sometimes the fallow fields are adding up for some species, but not in all cases. And of course, this sort of worked across the board for a lot of our more shrubland-loving birds. Our bobwhite quail, like I said, we're only finding them on about 10% of our sites, but most of those are restored native warm season grass and forb mixes. Yellow-breasted chats, same story. Again, we're seeing them more often in fallow fields, but significantly higher densities in the wildlife fields. And prairie warblers, same thing, higher densities in the wildlife fields. So what this is telling us is this is not only a practice that's working for quail, it's working across the board for shrubland species. We had a landowner we were working with that also worked with a private lands biologist to convert over 400 acres of cool season pasture to quail habitat. And year after year, he was waiting and waiting and waiting for the quail to come back. We're doing surveys and we're finding like blue grosbeaks and prairie warblers and chats, and we're all like, oh my gosh, it's working. And he's like, it's not working. There's no quail. So unfortunately, because of the landscape context, we've been talking a lot about neighbors and the landscape context, we never saw wild populations of quail there. So this particular landowner ended up converting that back to crops. And unfortunately, we've lost this critical habitat for all of these other declining species. Like the prairie warbler, we've lost more than 70% of their population. So that's pretty critical habitat for them. And it's not limited to the breeding season. We have a whole other suite of communities that are using these fields during the winter. We see the odd sighting of the snowy owl that comes to the National Mall. They're also using our fields out in rural Virginia. Loggerhead shrikes, harriers, all of these species are using these fields for the winter. So I do just want to show you a case study from one of the farms we worked with that converted one of their hay fields into a wildlife meadow. So they did it specifically for pollinator habitat, but really heavily populated with forbs and some native warm season grasses. And what we found from 2 years of winter bird surveys is we saw significantly higher number of species using that field compared to a traditional cool season grass field, a hay field. And then also the mean number of birds per survey was significantly higher. So you'll see in the traditional hay field, we may have been getting 1 song sparrow per survey versus flushing something like 35 different kinds of sparrows as we're walking through these tall grasses. So really significant habitat year round. So as a result of this research, we've come up with this field management risk calendar. Bernadette showed this a little bit earlier. And this is really a broad look at when the most vulnerable times are to be managing a field. And I think this calendar works really well, especially for these wildlife fields, right? So if we are going to be burning or bush hogging a warm season grass meadow, that time between February and April 1st is really ideal because then you're leaving that tall winter cover for your bobwhites, for your overwintering birds. You're bush hogging and burning with enough time for vegetation to grow back before the nesting season. For meadowlarks, that's starting as early as April 15th. So this is a really ideal calendar for birds. We've also been talking about timing of burning and how it impacts the vegetation community. So, you need to be thinking about what your end goal is. If you're trying to get away from a field that's got a high density of grasses, this might not work for you. But if you're really wanting to focus on birds for a few years, this is a great resource to use, and it's on our website. So I also wanted to touch on cool season hayfields and pastures because that's also a big part of the research that we're doing right now. And also because as we were doing analyses on all of these bird species, our grassland obligates, the ones that are nesting directly on the ground, so our eastern meadowlark, our grasshopper sparrows, we were finding them in surprisingly higher densities in our agricultural fields. And I know Dan Smollett at Chino, you guys have high densities of grasshopper sparrows in the warm season grass fields. We just aren't seeing that in the fields we're studying in Virginia. And so we really recognize that this is a population sink for these birds, right? We heard from Bernadette about haying practices, how they can cause 100% mortality. Also, high density grazing can cause a high incidence of trampling. So we're looking at a really high mortality of nestlings during the growing season. So we launched a new study with American Farmland Trust and with 6 local producers because we knew we wanted to incorporate bird conservation, but we also wanted to integrate the production needs of the farmers. So they actually helped develop the research design and the different experimental treatments for this project. So whatever we ended up learning, it could still work for the producer. So I want to quickly go through our treatments because what we've been finding is pretty significant, and we think that this can really help producers in the future as far as working for both birds and production. So we had 2 grazing treatments. The first is just graze continuously through the nesting season, and the second is what we call summer stockpiled. So it's grazed early in the season. The producers can take advantage of that nice early spring growth. They take their livestock off right around May 15th when peak nesting starts, and then they stockpile those grasses for grazing later in the season. So for summer stockpiling, or you could even winter stockpile that field. Then we had 2 hay treatments, so an early hay. So this allows the producer to take off that high nutritional value hay at the beginning of the season as long as it's before June 1st, and then they let it rest afterwards, like Bernadette was talking about in her talk. And then we had a separate one that we called delay hay, cut after June 15th. Now Bernadette, her research is showing that June 1st date is really important, but we also wanted to find a compromise with the producers. So we could find something that could potentially work. So our team is literally out still. It's June 20th, and there's, I think, 2 nests left in fields that they're looking at. But here are the 5 species we're focusing on. Bobolink, savanna sparrows, red-winged blackbirds are nesting a lot in these fields. Grasshopper sparrows, meadowlarks. We've even had a couple of Henslow sparrows, which their first breeding in the state since 2005. So really exciting find by this team. And this is what it looks like. This is an eastern meadowlark nesting in a hayfield, one of our study sites. So you're walking through the hayfield and you can't see the nests when you're walking through. They make these tiny little caves in the grasses, so they're really difficult to find. So kudos to our team. They have tracked down 279 nests like this just this season. So here's what we're finding. What we're finding is those stockpiled and delayed hay treatments produce the highest rate of reproductive success across all the treatments. And of course we expected this with the delayed hay, but the summer stockpiled, we were really excited to see this because the delayed hay, American Farmland Trust was also taking nutritional samples from this hay and sending away to the lab. And they found that there was a reduction in nutritional quality, which we expected. But the stockpiled fields actually resulted in standing forage that was suitable for multiple classes of livestock. So producers were able to extend their grazing season. They could actually reduce the amount of hay they were feeding because they had grasses throughout the late summer and the early winter. And it seemed from their perspective and their feedback to us that it was a system that was really working for them. This also allowed us to get a better sense of when our birds are breeding in Virginia. So Bernadette touched on this as to when the majority of our birds have fledged by. So right now, our peak haying in Virginia is that window between May 20th and June 10th. At that time, we're causing about 80% mortality of our fledglings, maybe even more. That's a conservative estimate. If we can just delay haying till July 1st, we have 80% fledging. So this is actually a number where we think we could sustain a population, if not grow a population of grassland birds. Now, if you look in between that, right around June 15th, that's the date we've been working on with some producers. So we're looking at about a 65% success rate. That's still incredible compared to a 0 or 20. So what we're doing with Bernadette's research is we're trying to find that magic number. At what point can we say, okay, now we're contributing to a population sink versus we're sustaining a healthy population of birds? So bringing it back to this calendar, something in cool season grass fields we've learned very quickly is only haying once a year doesn't necessarily work if you want to be producing really good hay off of that hay every year. So what we're suggesting now is that July 1st cutoff date, cut your fields, make sure you take or you harvest that hay off of your fields, and that's going to prevent integration of some of the weeds like the warm season weeds like Johnson grass, like some of those, like crown beard, all of these things that sort of grow in the warm season that a lot of hay producers don't necessarily want in their crop. So we are still modifying this chart every year to make sure that we can incorporate the needs of producers as well. So one last thing that I wanted to cover is it doesn't all end when the birds leave the nest, right? We have all of these fledglings that leave the nest, and we can't assume that they're all going to survive. Because once we cut the fields, it sort of leaves a lot of open habitat that could potentially lead to more mortality. So Bernadette has started a new study where we're actually looking at habitat use by fledgling birds. This is our field site, and we're using this because there's so many different kinds of habitats on the farm, including a golf course across the road. And so we can see how these fledglings are using all of these different habitats and then how that habitat use is influencing their ultimate survival. So Bernadette and our team are attaching tiny tags, they're less than a gram, to 3 different species, the bobolink, the American kestrel, and the eastern meadowlark. And this is when they're still in the nest, so once they leave the nest, we can actually track their movements every 3 seconds. It's an insane amount of data. So I'm just gonna show you one day. This is a day in the life of one of our bobolink fledglings. And as you might remember, there was a multitude of hay fields, pastures, native warm season grasses on this farm. The majority of those orange points, those are the daytime points for the bobolink. So it's spending most of its time in tall, uncut hay fields. It's foraging in pastures that are actively grazed, but for the most part, it's taking cover in uncut hay fields. At night, these blue circles, it's actually roosting in the native meadow, in a wildflower meadow that was put in for quail and pollinator habitat. So this is especially fascinating to us because through all of our years of study, we've thought our bobolinks are sticking to those cool season fields, and we're finding just how important it is, not only for quail, but other species, to make sure that we're integrating these wildlife meadows amongst our agricultural landscapes to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of these different species. So we are a research-based organization, and yet we're surrounded by all these incredible NGOs that are doing amazing work with landowners. And we really wanted to seek out their help to help us better translate this research into action. And we launched the Virginia Grassland Bird Initiative. So while VWL and Smithsonian were leading the research portion, we're working closely with Piedmont Environmental Council, who are experts in land conservation and preservation. American Farmland Trust is providing consultations to producers on regenerative agriculture. And then we have Quail Forever, who are experts in habitat restoration and have very close ties to state funding programs. So bringing all of this expertise to the table has really allowed us to amplify our work and our messaging. And as a result of this collaboration, we launched a new incentive program. So we recognize that maybe adopting some of these best management practices may be off-putting to a producer, but what if we could incentivize them to do that? So thanks to several grants from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and the Volcano Foundation, we've been able to pay farmers to delay their haying or to adopt summer stockpiling. And the first year, we set aside 1,800 acres. And from our research, we estimate that we were able to successfully fledge over 15,000 birds that would have otherwise maybe not made it due to management practices. So we're really excited about this. We have another 2 years of funding right now through NIFWIF that will be doing this program. And because of its success, and thanks so much to Quail Forever, I know there's a lot of you here today, they really helped us get better connected with NRCS, and we've now launched a new funding initiative through EQIP in Virginia. So it's 511 forage and harvest management where producers will be able to get up to $70 an acre for delaying their hay until July 1st. They'll also be able to apply for up to $50 an acre through EQIP 528, which is prescribed grazing, and that's to incorporate summer stockpiling into the rotational grazing regime. So we're really excited for that, and Quail Forever really took the lead on helping us get our research out to NRCS to make that happen. So we're really grateful for that. And so that's all I've got for you today. I hope I didn't go too over 20 minutes, but happy to take questions. And I've got some cards with me too if you're interested in my personal email.
Are you looking in the future of using forages that will delay? Because most probably these fields were tall fescue orchard grass. Are you looking for ones that delay into it? Because I used to do 511s, and there are different varieties that you do for harvesting at a later date.
That's a great question. Thanks for asking that. So the question was, are we looking at different forages that could potentially be harvested later to accommodate this delayed haying? We are, but there's not wide use of it yet. So for example, that farm I showed you the map of, they've got several fields in brome right now, and brome is a much later maturing grass. So they never harvest that hay until the last week of June, maybe even July 1st. And they would do that anyways, even if they weren't trying to conserve grassland birds. So unfortunately, we don't have enough fields in brome to really conclude that that is the way to go. And I don't know much about brome grass nutritionally. I'm not a producer, but I'd love to talk to more folks about that. Another forage would be the warm season grasses.
How about the different cultivars of tall fescue that have been mixed, that are showing to delayed? I mean, with the warm seasons coming in.
We have not looked at that at all yet, but I'll add it to my list.
But Elmer Dengler used to be an NRCS grazing specialist, and we have a whole list from the NRCS.
We should talk. I'd love to learn more about that because we're always looking for ways to make it work for both the producer as well as the birds. And if we can identify grasses that work better for a delayed harvest, then all the better. So thank you for that.
Are warm season grass hays a feasible
So warm season grass hays are a feasible option. Now in Virginia, the few that we have surveyed that are used for hay are planted so densely. You know, they were planted maybe 10, 15 years ago when we were recommending a much higher seed density, and our grassland birds aren't using them. They're just too dense. In the winter, though, they are full of birds. So what I'd like to do is identify more fields that have been planted potentially more recently at a lower seed density, sort of like what we see at Chino Farms. You know, it's a little sparser, and we're seeing grasshopper sparrows, meadowlarks in those fields. But as far as the fields we've been looking at in Virginia, we just haven't been seeing these ground nesting birds using those. So we haven't really seen a huge benefit to those specific birds. Yeah. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Amy.